Been more than 4 years since Summer Wells was last seen. The then 5-year-old was reported missing from her home in the Beach Creek community in Hawkins County.
There's been no sign of the little girl since, and law enforcement from several agencies have worked countless tips over the years. News Channel 11's Ansley Daniel spoke with TBI, who says the case is far from cold. Anson?
We don't have the evidence in this case to know for sure whether or not Summer was abducted or whether or not she walked away from her home and became lost. I would say this case has not gone cold. Cold case is typically framed up as a case where there are no tips or leads that are coming in and there are no investigative efforts that are happening because there is no place to travel with the investigation.
For 4 years, law enforcement told the public there were only 2 ways Summer Wells could have disappeared. They were wrong. And on November 13th, 2024, the FBI proved it. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments. Let's see how far this story has traveled. If you're new to Criminal Instinct, you're about to go deep into a case that doesn't add up. We don't just repeat what the news says, we dig into what they won't say. So hit that subscribe button right now, turn on notifications, and buckle up, because this one's going to make you question everything you thought you knew about missing children cases. On that cold November morning, federal agents descended on a remote property in Greenville, Tennessee. FBI, TBI, Hawkins County Sheriff's Office, all moving in coordinated silence. The location? 3,500 Van Hill Road, a 27-acre stretch of wooded land owned by an elderly man most people had never heard of. The target of the search? A little girl who vanished more than 4 years ago from a house nearly 10 miles away. Her name was Summer Wells. She was 5 years old, and the raid on Van Hill Road just shattered every official explanation law enforcement has given since the day she disappeared. But to understand why that raid matters, we have to go back to the beginning, back to the day Summer vanished, back to a small, isolated community in East Tennessee where nothing is quite what it seems. It was June 15th, 2021, a Tuesday, hot, humid, the kind of summer day in East Tennessee where the air sits heavy on your skin and the cicadas scream from the trees. Beach Creek is a small, unincorporated community in Hawkins County, tucked into the folds of the Appalachian foothills. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where roads don't have streetlights, and where help is a long way off if you need it. The Wells family lived on Ben Hill Road, a narrow, winding stretch of asphalt that climbs up into the ridges. Their house sat on a slope, surrounded by dense woods, with a steep drop-off behind it. Isolation wasn't just a feature of the landscape, it was a way of life. Summer Moon, Utah. Wells was the youngest of 4 children. Blonde hair, big eyes. A little girl who loved being outside, who played in the dirt, who ran around barefoot like so many kids do in rural America. Her mother, Candace Bly, was home that day. So were Summer's 3 older brothers. Her father, Don Wells, was at work. It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon, but by 6:30 that evening, Summer was gone, and the 911 call that followed would launch one of the most confusing, contradictory, and unresolved missing child investigations in recent memory. The initial response was massive. Local law enforcement, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, FBI, search and rescue teams, volunteers, drones, helicopters, tracking dogs. They combed the woods around Ben Hill Road for days. They searched ravines, creeks, abandoned structures, and neighboring properties. An Amber Alert went out across the state. Summer's face appeared on news stations, social media, missing person flyers. The community rallied, but as the hours turned into days, and the days turned into weeks, something became painfully clear. No one could find her. Not a piece of clothing, not a shoe, not a single trace. And then the official narrative began to take shape. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the lead agency on the case, settled on 2 possible explanations, 2 and only 2. Either Summer was abducted by an unknown person, or she wandered away from the house and became lost in the surrounding wilderness. TBI Assistant Director Josh Melton repeated this framework in press conferences, in interviews, in public statements. "We don't have the evidence to know for sure," he said, "but those are the 2 scenarios we're working with." He was careful to add that the case had not gone cold. Tips were still coming in, Investigators were still following leads, but the message was clear: abduction or wandered off. Those were the only options on the table, except they weren't. Because 4 years later, federal agents showed up at a property that doesn't fit either theory. A property that's too far for a 5-year-old to walk. A property with no direct connection to the Wells family home. A property that requires a vehicle, a plan, and a reason to be there. And that's where the official story starts to crack. Let's talk about what we know. Summer was reported missing around 6:30 p.m. on June 15th. The last time anyone claims to have seen her was sometime that afternoon. But here's the problem. There are 3 different versions of what happened in those final moments. 3 versions that cannot all be true. The first version came from Candace Bly herself, recorded by a local news station, WJHL, on June 16th, the day after Summer disappeared. In that interview, Candace said she went inside the house to do something, just for a few minutes. When she came back outside, Summer was gone. Simple, straightforward. Summer was outside. Candace went in. Summer vanished. That's version 1. But then the story changed. In later interviews, Candace described a completely different sequence of events. She said Summer came back inside the house, that she walked her downstairs into the basement to play with her toys, that she spent a moment helping Grandus, Summer's grandmother, who was also at the house that day, and when she went back to check on Summer, the basement door was open, and Summer was gone. This version places Summer's last known location inside the residence. Not outside, not near the flower bed. Inside, in the basement, with an exit through a back door. That's version 2. Now here's version 3. According to Hawkins County Sheriff Ronnie Lawson, the 3 Wells brothers, Summer's older siblings, told investigators that they saw Summer walk out the back door, not that she was playing in the basement, not that she was outside and then disappeared. They said they saw her leave, through the back door, on her own. So which is it? Was Summer last seen outside? Was she last seen in the basement? Or was she last seen walking out the back door? These are not minor discrepancies. These are foundational contradictions. And in a missing child case, the last known location is everything. It determines where you search, how you search, what kind of disappearance model you apply. If you don't know where the child was last seen, you don't know where to start. And if the people who were there that day can't agree on what happened, then the entire timeline becomes unreliable. From a forensic standpoint, this is a red flag, a big one, because when caregivers provide conflicting accounts of a child's last moments, it suggests one of 2 things. Either the memory is fragmented due to trauma, or the narrative is being constructed reactively, meaning it's changing in response to external pressure. And in this case, the changes aren't subtle, they're structural. They rewrite the entire scene. What time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments. I want to see how many of you are still awake, still paying attention, still asking the same questions I am. Now, let's add another layer. 4 days after Summer disappeared, on June 19th, tracking dogs led search teams to a discovery. Footprints, not on the Wells property, not near the house, but on 2 adjacent parcels of land belonging to neighbors. One property owned by a man named Mr. Phillips, the other owned by a woman named Mary Sexton. These properties sit off Fields Road, a location that's downhill from Ben Hill Road, but separated by dense woods, uneven terrain, and natural obstacles. The footprints were found in the dirt, in the woods, and they were significant enough that law enforcement immediately expanded the search in that area. But here's what they didn't do. They didn't tell the public which direction the footprints were going. They didn't confirm whether the prints matched Summer's size. They didn't say if it was a continuous trail or just isolated impressions. They didn't clarify whether the prints were found in dense forest or along a path. And to this day, more than 4 years later, the TBI has never publicly addressed the footprints in detail. Why does that matter? Because footprints are not ambiguous. They either lead somewhere or they don't. They either match the timeline or they don't. The fact that law enforcement mobilized resources, brought in additional personnel, and expanded the search grid tells us one thing. Those footprints were relevant, but the silence around them tells us something else. They didn't fit the narrative. If Summer wandered off, you'd expect footprints near the house, maybe down a trail, maybe toward a creek, but not nearly a mile away on someone else's property. And if she was abducted, you wouldn't expect footprints at all. You'd expect a vehicle, a quick extraction, no trail. So what do the footprints represent? They represent movement, deliberate movement, through the woods, away from Ben Hill Road, toward Fields Road. And that opens the door to a third possibility, one that law enforcement has never publicly acknowledged. Human-mediated movement. Someone moved Summer, not a stranger who grabbed her off the road, not a random act, but someone who knew the area, someone who had access, someone who could guide a child through the woods without being seen. And that brings us back to Van Hill Road, because when you plot the locations on a map, something becomes impossible to ignore. Ben Hill Road, Fields Road, Van Hill Road, they all fall along the same directional line, southeast, away from the Wells home, through wooded terrain, toward a road network that connects the entire region. It's not a random scattering of locations, it's a corridor, a pathway, and every piece of physical evidence, every geographic clue, every investigative action points in the same direction. The TBI says they're working two theories, abduction or wandered off, but their actions tell a different story, because neither of those theories explains why federal agents showed up at a property 9.5 miles away. Neither theory explains footprints found in the woods days after the disappearance. Neither theory explains why the family's timeline keeps changing, and neither theory explains why, after 4 years and more than 6,500 tips, there's still no suspect, no arrest, and no answers. So here's the question I want you to think about. If the official story doesn't fit the evidence, then what really happened to Summer Wells? Was she taken by someone she knew? Was she moved in stages, from one location to another, using roads and terrain that only a local would understand? And if that's true, then why has law enforcement spent 4 years promoting two theories that don't account for the most important clue of all? The fact that every trail leads away from Ben Hill Road, and every trail points toward the same hidden path. If this case is keeping you up at night, if you're starting to see the cracks in the official narrative, then you need to subscribe to Criminal Instinct right now. Hit that bell, turn on notifications, because we're not done. Not even close. This is just the beginning. And the deeper we go, the more the story unravels. Summer Wells was 5 years old. She deserved to be safe. She deserved to be found. And she deserves the truth. Not the version law enforcement wants us to believe, but the version the evidence actually supports. So stay with me, because in the next part, we're going to pull back the curtain on the people, the places, and the patterns that everyone else is too afraid to talk about. Subscribe, comment, share this video, and let's make sure Summer's story doesn't get buried. The FBI doesn't show up at your door unless they know something. And on November 13th, 2024, they knew enough to bring shovels. Let's talk about Van Hill Road, because this isn't just another search. This is the first time in over 4 years that law enforcement has publicly acted on a location that contradicts everything they've been telling us. Remember, the official line has always been simple. Summer either wandered off into the woods and got lost, or she was taken by a stranger. But Van Hill Road is 9.5 miles from the Wells home. That's not wandering distance. That's not even close. A 5-year-old child doesn't cover that kind of ground on foot, not through dense Appalachian terrain, not without water, not without help. So, if Summer didn't walk there, and a stranger didn't randomly drive her there, then how did this location become relevant? The property sits in Greenville, Tennessee, in a rural pocket where homes are spread out and privacy is the norm. It's 27 acres of wooded land, thick trees, uneven ground. The kind of place where you could hide almost anything and no one would know. The owner? An elderly man named Paul Hill. And here's where it gets interesting. Paul Hill is related by blood to a man named Fred Hill. And Fred Hill lived on Ben Hill Road at the time Summer disappeared. Now, before we go any further, let me be clear. Owning property doesn't make you guilty. Being related to someone doesn't make you complicit. But in a missing child case, geography matters. Relationships matter. And when the FBI spends resources searching a location tied to someone who lived on the same road where a child vanished, that's not a coincidence. That's a connection. And connections are exactly what investigators look for when they're building a map of movement. So who is Fred Hill? And why does his name keep coming up? Fred Hill is what you'd call a peripheral figure. He wasn't a suspect. He wasn't a witness of record. He wasn't someone law enforcement publicly named as relevant to the case. But from the very beginning, Fred inserted himself into the narrative. He gave interviews, he made statements, he offered timelines, and almost every single one of them contained contradictions. He claimed to have seen people on Ben Hill Road at specific times, but when those people were asked, they had alibis, verified alibis, employer records, security footage, timestamps that proved they weren't where Fred said they were. He described movements that didn't match the known facts. He referenced events that couldn't be corroborated, and yet he kept talking. Now, does that make him guilty of something? Not necessarily. It makes him unreliable, and in an investigation, unreliable informants are dangerous, not because they're lying, though some do, but because they create noise. They distort the timeline, they send investigators down dead ends, they muddy the water, and in a case like this, where the water was already murky, Fred Hill's statements didn't help, they made things worse. But here's the thing about unreliable narrators. Even when they're wrong, they reveal patterns. They talk about the places they know, the people they're familiar with, the roads they travel, and if you pay close enough attention, those patterns start to form a map of associations, a map of proximity, a map that might just lead somewhere no one expected. Fred Hill lived on Ben Hill Road. His relative owns property on Van Hill Road, and the FBI just searched that property. So the question isn't whether Fred is guilty. The question is, what does he know? And why does every road in this case seem to circle back to the same family name? What's the weather like where you are today? Sunny? Rainy? Drop it in the comments. I want to know who's still with me. Let's go back to June 15th, 2021, the day Summer disappeared. Because if we're going to understand what happened, we need to understand the timeline. Or more accurately, we need to understand why there isn't one. Candace Bly, Summer's mother, has given multiple versions of the events leading up to Summer's disappearance. And I'm not talking about small differences. I'm talking about completely different stories. In her first interview with WJHL, recorded the day after Summer went missing, Candace said she went inside the house briefly. When she came back out, Summer was gone. That's it. Simple. Direct. Summer was outside. Candace went inside. Summer vanished. But in later interviews, the story changed. Candace said Summer came back inside the house, that she walked her down into the basement to play with toys, that she helped Grandis, Summer's grandmother, for a moment. And when she went back to check on Summer, the basement door was open. Summer was gone. So now, Summer's last known location isn't outside anymore. It's inside, in the basement, with an exit through a back door. And then there's a third version. Sheriff Ronnie Lawson stated that the three Wells brothers, Summer's older siblings, told investigators they saw Summer walk out the back door, not that she was in the basement, not that she was outside and disappeared. They said they saw her leave, on her own, through the back door. So let me ask you this. If you were the last person to see a missing child, would you forget where you saw them? Would your story change? Would you describe three completely different scenarios depending on who was asking? Or would you remember exactly where you were, exactly what you were doing, and exactly when you realized something was wrong? Memory under trauma can be fragmented. That's true. Stress does strange things to the brain. But fragmentation doesn't rewrite entire scenes. It doesn't move a child from outside to inside, to walking out a door. Fragmentation creates gaps. It doesn't create alternate realities. And when the gaps are this big, when the contradictions are this severe, investigators don't just take notes. They start asking why. Why does the story keep changing? Why can't the people who were there that day agree on the most basic facts? And why has law enforcement never publicly addressed these contradictions? From a forensic perspective, the timeline is the foundation of everything. It tells you where to search. It tells you what kind of disappearance you're dealing with. It tells you who had access, who had opportunity, and who might have had motive. But when the foundation is unstable, when the last known location shifts depending on the interview, the entire investigation becomes compromised. You can't build a case on sand. And right now, the Summer Wells timeline is quicksand. Let's talk about what happened 4 days later. June 19th, 2021. Tracking dogs were working the area around Ben Hill Road, following scent trails, trying to find any indication of where Summer might have gone. And they found something. Footprints. Not on the Wells property, not in the immediate area, but on two neighboring properties. One belonged to a man named Mr. Phillips. The other belonged to a woman named Mary Sexton. Both properties sit off Fields Road, a location that's downhill from Ben Hill Road, but separated by dense woods and rough terrain. The discovery was significant enough that law enforcement immediately expanded the search. They brought in more personnel. They deployed drones. They canvassed the surrounding area. But here's what they didn't do. They didn't tell the public which direction the footprints were going. They didn't confirm whether the prints matched Summer's size. They didn't say if it was a continuous trail or isolated impressions. They didn't clarify whether the prints were in the woods or along a path. And they've never, in more than 4 years, publicly addressed those footprints again. Why? If the footprints were irrelevant, law enforcement could have said so. If they didn't match Summer, they could have ruled them out. But they didn't. Which means one of two things. Either the footprints are still considered relevant, or they revealed something investigators don't want the public to know. Let me tell you what those footprints represent from a forensic standpoint. They represent movement, directional movement, away from the Wells property, through wooded terrain, toward Fields Road. And Fields Road is important because it's a transitional point. It's where the woods meet the road system. It's where someone on foot could meet someone in a vehicle. It's where a child could be transferred from one location to another without being seen. If Summer wandered off, you'd expect to find footprints near the house, maybe down a trail, maybe toward a creek or a clearing, but not a mile away on someone else's land. Wandering doesn't follow a straight line. It's chaotic, random. A child who's lost moves in circles. They backtrack, they get disoriented. They don't travel in a single direction through dense forest and end up on a neighbor's property. That's not wandering. That's being led. And if Summer was abducted by a stranger, you wouldn't expect footprints at all. You'd expect a vehicle, a quick grab. No trail, no trace. But the footprints suggest something else entirely. They suggest that Summer, or someone carrying Summer, moved through the woods deliberately, with purpose, toward a specific destination. And that destination was Fields Road. Now let's connect the dots. Ben Hill Road is where Summer disappeared. Fields Road is where the footprints were found. And Van Hill Road is where the FBI just conducted a search. When you plot those three locations on a map, they fall along the same directional axis, southeast, away from the Wells home, through wooded corridors, toward a broader road network. It's not random, it's a pathway, a corridor, and every piece of physical evidence points in the same direction. But there's another element we need to talk about, something that's been sitting in plain sight since day one, but hasn't been given the attention it deserves. Tree trimming crews. On June 15th, 2021, the day Summer disappeared, tree trimming crews were working in the area around Ben Hill Road. These crews were contracted to clear branches away from power lines, a routine job in rural areas where vegetation can interfere with electrical infrastructure. They had trucks, they had equipment, they had access to multiple properties, and they had a legitimate reason to be there. No one questions a tree trimming crew. They're part of the landscape. They're expected. They're invisible. Now here's where it gets interesting. One of Paul Hill's sons, the same Paul Hill who owns the property on Van Hill Road that the FBI just searched, owns a tree trimming business. Does that mean his company was working on Ben Hill Road that day? Not necessarily. The crew that was reported in the area has been described as a different entity, but the overlap is impossible to ignore. You have tree trimmers working near the Wells home on the day Summer disappeared. You have a family member of a Ben Hill Road resident who owns a tree service, and you have a property connected to that same family being searched by federal agents 4 years later. Let me tell you why tree trimming crews matter in a case like this. They have mobility. They move from property to property throughout the day. They have vehicles that match the general description of trucks law enforcement was looking for. Remember the TBI's announcement about a red or maroon Toyota Tacoma with a ladder rack spotted in the Beach Creek area on June 14th or 15th? Tree trimming crews often drive trucks exactly like that. They have open beds, ladder racks, toolboxes. They're designed to carry equipment, but they could also carry other things, and no one would notice. Tree trimmers also have geographic knowledge. They know which roads connect. They know which areas are accessible. They know where vehicles can be parked without drawing attention. They understand the terrain because they work in it every day. And most importantly, their presence doesn't raise alarms. A tree-trimming truck parked on the side of a rural road? Normal. Workers walking through wooded areas near homes? Expected. A brief stop to load or unload equipment? Routine. It's the perfect operational cover. So here's the question. Did law enforcement fully investigate every tree-trimming crew that was in the area on June 15th? Did they account for every worker, every vehicle, every route? Did they cross-reference crew rosters with the people connected to Ben Hill Road and Van Hill Road? Because if they didn't, that's not just an oversight. That's a gap. A big one. If you're starting to see how all of these pieces fit together, hit that like button right now. Share this video. Because the more people who see this, the harder it becomes to ignore. And trust me, there are people who would very much like this to be ignored. Let's talk about behavior. Because in cases where physical evidence is limited, behavior becomes the evidence. And the behavior of Don Wells and Candace Bly, Summer's parents, has been analyzed, dissected, and debated since the day Summer disappeared. Some of it is explainable, some of it is concerning, and some of it is just flat out inconsistent with what you'd expect from parents whose child was taken by a stranger. Let's start with Don Wells. In multiple interviews, Don has referenced death, not as a distant possibility, not as something he's afraid of, but as something he's accepted. He's described dreams where Summer appears in a perfect, heaven-like environment. He's talked about her being buried. He's used language that suggests finality, and when asked to plead for Summer's return, he refused. He said he was done pleading, that he wasn't going to do it anymore. Now, think about that for a second. If your child was missing, if you believed there was even a chance they were alive, would you stop pleading? Would you stop asking for help? Would you stop begging whoever took them to bring them back? Or would you do it every single day until you had answers? Don's refusal to plead is what behavioral analysts call distancing language. It's a psychological signal that indicates emotional separation from the subject. It suggests that the speaker has already accepted an outcome, and in missing child cases, that kind of acceptance, especially early on, is a red flag. Because parents who genuinely believe their child is alive don't give up. They don't stop fighting. They don't normalize death. Candace Bly's behavior is different, but equally problematic. Her narrative has shifted multiple times. Her recall is fragmented, and when pressed on specific details, she shuts down. On Dr. Phil, when questioned about certain aspects of the timeline, Candace became avoidant. She withdrew. She deflected. Now, avoidance isn't proof of guilt. It's proof of discomfort. But the question is, what is she uncomfortable about? Is it the trauma of losing her daughter, or is it the fear of saying something that contradicts an earlier statement? There's also the issue of search activity, or more accurately, the lack of it. In cases of genuine stranger abduction, families typically organize independent searches. They raise funds, they coordinate with missing person organizations, they plaster flyers everywhere, they do interviews, they keep the case in the public eye. But over the past 4 years, there's been minimal sustained activity from the Wells family. No recurring press conferences, no organized search efforts, no visible engagement with advocacy groups, and that absence is noticeable. Does that mean Don and Candace are guilty? Not necessarily, but it means their behavior doesn't align with the statistical patterns observed in verified stranger abduction cases. And when behavior diverges from the norm, investigators pay attention, because behavior, even when it's not evidence of a crime, is evidence of something. It reveals internal belief states. It reveals what people think happened, even if they're not saying it out loud. Here's a question for you. If you were in their position, if your child vanished and you had no idea what happened, how would you act? Would you stop searching? Would you stop pleading? Would your story change every time someone asked you about it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know what you think. Now let's bring it all together. Because when you step back and look at the full picture, a pattern emerges. A pattern that law enforcement has never publicly acknowledged, but one that's impossible to ignore. You have 3 locations: Ben Hill Road, where Summer disappeared; Fields Road, where footprints were found; Van Hill Road, where the FBI just conducted a search. All three locations fall along the same directional corridor, southeast, away from the Wells home, through wooded terrain, toward a road network that connects the entire region. You have physical evidence, footprints that suggest deliberate movement through the woods, a scent trail that ends at the road, indicating possible vehicular transfer, and a search conducted by federal agents at a location that requires transportation to reach. You have operational presence. Tree trimming crews working in the area on the day Summer disappeared. Crews with vehicles, mobility, and geographic knowledge. Crews connected, at least tangentially, to the same family name that keeps appearing in this case. You have behavioral indicators, conflicting timelines from the family, distancing language, normalization of death, avoidance under questioning, and a lack of sustained search activity. And you have relational geography. Fred Hill lived on Ben Hill Road. Paul Hill owns property on Van Hill Road. Both are connected by blood. Both are connected to locations that matter in this investigation. When you map all of this out, when you plot the locations and trace the connections, you don't get a random scattering of clues. You get a convergence, a directional flow, a pathway that starts at Ben Hill Road and extends outward, through the woods, past Fields Road, and toward Van Hill Road. It's not speculation, it's pattern recognition, and patterns don't lie. The TBI says they're working two theories, abduction or wandered off. But their actions tell a different story, because neither of those theories explains the footprints, neither explains the Van Hill search, neither explains the timeline contradictions, and neither explains why, after 4 years and more than 6,500 tips, there's still no suspect, no arrest, and no resolution. So what's really going on here? Is law enforcement following a third theory they won't talk about? A theory that involves human-mediated movement? A theory that points towards someone with local knowledge, access, and opportunity? Or are they stuck in a framework that no longer fits the evidence? Here's what I know. Every independent clue in this case points in the same direction, away from Ben Hill Road, through the woods, toward a network of roads and properties connected by family, geography, and timing. The convergence is undeniable. The corridor is real, and the silence from law enforcement is deafening. If you're still watching, if you're still asking questions, if you're still demanding answers, then do this. Subscribe to Criminal Instinct right now. Turn on notifications. Share this video with everyone you know, because the only way this case gets solved is if people refuse to let it fade away. Summer Wells deserves better than silence. She deserves better than contradictions. She deserves the truth, and we're going to keep digging until we find it. There's an equation in forensic investigation that most people never hear about. It goes like this: origin plus pathway plus destination equals movement. And when all three align, you're not looking at theory anymore. You're looking at truth. In the Summer Wells case, we now have all three. The question is, does law enforcement? Let's start with the origin. Ben Hill Road. 110 Ben Hill Road, to be exact. That's where Summer was last seen, or at least, that's where she was last reported to be. We've already established that the timeline is unstable, that the family's accounts don't match, that the last known location shifts depending on who's telling the story. But regardless of which version you believe, one thing is certain: Summer was at that house on June 15th, 2021, and by 6:30 that evening, she was gone. Now, in any missing person case, the origin point is critical. It's where the investigation begins. It's where search teams deploy. It's where scent dogs start tracking. And in Summer's case, those dogs did pick up a trail. They followed her scent away from the house, downhill, toward the road, and then the scent stopped. Just stopped. Right there at the edge of Ben Hill Road. When a scent trail ends abruptly like that, it usually means one thing: vehicular transfer. The subject got into a vehicle, or was placed into a vehicle, and once that happens, the trail goes cold. Because dogs can't track a car. They can't follow exhaust fumes or tire tracks. The scent just vanishes. And that's exactly what happened here. Summer's scent led away from the house, down toward the road, and then disappeared, which tells us that whatever happened next, it didn't happen on foot. So we have our origin, Ben Hill Road, and we have an indicator of movement, scent trail ending at the road. Now let's talk about the pathway. 4 days after Summer disappeared, tracking dogs led investigators to a second location: footprints, found on 2 neighboring properties off Fields Road, one belonging to Mr. Phillips, the other to Mary Sexton. These weren't random prints. They were significant enough that law enforcement expanded the search immediately. They brought in additional resources, they combed the area, and then they went silent. To this day, the TBI has never publicly clarified the direction of those footprints. They've never confirmed whether they matched Summer's size. They've never explained whether it was a continuous trail or isolated impressions. But the fact that they mobilized resources tells us something. Those footprints mattered, and their location tells us even more. Fields Road sits downhill from Ben Hill Road. It's accessible through wooded terrain, dense forest, uneven ground, the kind of environment where someone could move without being seen, especially if they knew the area, especially if they had a reason to avoid the main roads. And here's the thing, Fields Road isn't just a random location, it's a transitional point. It's where the woods meet the road system. It's where someone on foot could meet someone in a vehicle. It's where a transfer could happen, quietly, quickly, without witnesses. So now we have origin and pathway. Ben Hill Road to wooded terrain to Fields Road. But the equation isn't complete yet, because we still need the destination. And that's where Van Hill Road comes in. November 13th, 2024. More than 4 years after Summer disappeared. FBI agents, TBI investigators, and Hawkins County Sheriff's deputies execute a search warrant at 3500 Van Hill Road, a 27-acre property owned by an elderly man named Paul Hill. The search wasn't publicized in advance. It wasn't announced. It just happened. And when the news broke, it sent shockwaves through the community. Because for the first time since Summer vanished, law enforcement was acting on a location that didn't fit the official narrative. Van Hill Road is 9.5 miles from Ben Hill Road. That's not wandering distance. That's not even close. A 5-year-old doesn't cover that kind of ground on foot, not through Appalachian terrain, not without help. So if the FBI is searching that property, it's because they have reason to believe Summer, or evidence related to Summer, ended up there. And that means someone moved her, deliberately, with intent, along a specific route. Now here's where the equation comes together. When you plot Ben Hill Road, Fields Road, and Van Hill Road on a map, they don't scatter randomly. They align. They fall along the same directional axis, southeast, away from the Wells home, through wooded corridors, toward a broader road network. It's not coincidence, it's convergence, and convergence is what investigators look for when they're mapping movement. Origin, Ben Hill Road. Pathway, wooded terrain leading to Fields Road. Destination, Van Hill Road. The equation is complete, and it points to one conclusion. Summer Wells didn't wander off. She didn't vanish into thin air. She was moved, and the route she was moved along is now visible, not through speculation, but through geography, physical evidence, and investigative action. But there's another layer to this, because Van Hill Road isn't just a random piece of land, it's connected. Paul Hill, the property owner, is related to Fred Hill, and Fred Hill lived on Ben Hill Road at the time Summer disappeared. So now we're not just talking about geography, we're talking about relational geography, family ties, proximity, access, and that changes everything. Let me be clear, owning property doesn't make you guilty. Being related to someone doesn't make you complicit. But in a missing child investigation, connections matter. Because crimes like this, crimes involving the disappearance of a child from a rural home, are rarely committed by strangers. Statistically, the vast majority of cases involve someone the child knew, someone with access, someone with opportunity, someone who understood the environment well enough to move through it without being detected. And when you have a family connection linking the origin point to the destination point, that's not something you ignore. That's something you investigate, thoroughly. And it appears that's exactly what the FBI is doing. Now let's talk about the operational element, the tree trimming crews, because this is where the pathway becomes even more plausible. On June 15th, tree trimming crews were working near Ben Hill Road. They had trucks, they had equipment, they had legitimate reasons to be in the area, and one of Paul Hill's sons owns a tree trimming business. Does that mean his company was there that day? We don't know. but the overlap is striking. Tree trimming crews are mobile. They move from property to property. They travel rural roads. They have vehicles that match the description law enforcement was looking for, a red or maroon Toyota Tacoma with a ladder rack. That's exactly the kind of truck a tree service would use, and their presence doesn't raise suspicion. They're expected. They're part of the landscape, which makes them the perfect operational cover for moving something, or someone, without being noticed. If a tree trimming crew was working near Ben Hill Road on June 15th, and if that crew had any connection to the Van Hill property, then the pathway becomes more than theoretical. It becomes operational. It becomes a route that could have been used to transport Summer from one location to another, through the woods, along back roads, to a property where she could be hidden, or worse. And here's the question law enforcement needs to answer. Did they fully investigate every tree trimming crew in the area that day? Did they account for every worker, every vehicle, every route? Because if they didn't, that's not just an oversight, that's a failure. Let's shift to the behavioral evidence, because while geography and physical clues point in one direction, behavior points in the same direction. And the behavior of Don Wells and Candace Bly has been inconsistent from the start. Don's language has been filled with death imagery, dreams of summer in heaven, references to burial, a refusal to plead for her return. That's not the language of a parent holding out hope. That's the language of someone who's already accepted an outcome. And acceptance, especially this early, suggests knowledge, not necessarily guilt, but knowledge, a belief that Summer isn't coming home. And if he believes that, the question is, why? Candace's behavior is different but equally telling. Her timeline has changed. Her recall is fragmented. She avoids certain questions. She shuts down under pressure. And over 4 years, there's been minimal sustained search activity from the family. No organized efforts, no public campaigns, no visible fight to keep Summer's case in the spotlight, and that absence speaks volumes. In verified stranger abduction cases, families are relentless. They search, they fundraise, they advocate, they refuse to let the case go cold. But that's not what we've seen here, and the lack of activity, combined with the contradictions in their statements, suggests something else. Not necessarily involvement, but awareness, a sense that the outcome is already known. And if that's true, then the official narrative, the one that says Summer was either abducted by a stranger or wandered off, falls apart completely. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a case that's been publicly framed around 2 theories that don't fit the evidence. And it leaves us with a third theory, one that law enforcement has never openly acknowledged, that fits everything: human-mediated movement. Someone moved Summer from Ben Hill Road through wooded terrain near Fields Road and ultimately to or near Van Hill Road. That someone had local knowledge, that someone had access, that someone had a vehicle, and that someone may have had help. The Convergence Corridor is real, the footprints are real, the scent trail is real, the FBI search is real, and the connections between Ben Hill Road and Van Hill Road are real. All of it points in the same direction, away from the official story, and toward a truth that's been hidden in plain sight for more than 4 years. Here's what we know for certain. Summer Wells didn't vanish into thin air. She didn't wander off into the wilderness and disappear without a trace. And she wasn't taken by a random stranger who happened to be driving through a remote area at exactly the right time. What happened to Summer was deliberate. It was planned. And it involved people who knew the area, knew the roads, and knew how to move without being seen. The question now is whether law enforcement will follow the evidence where it leads, or whether they'll continue to cling to a narrative that no longer holds up under scrutiny, because the evidence is there, the pathway is there, the connections are there, and the longer they wait, the colder the trail becomes. But here's the thing. Cases like this don't get solved by law enforcement alone. They get solved when people refuse to let them fade away, when communities demand answers, when the public keeps asking questions, when pressure builds to the point where silence is no longer an option. And that's where you come in. If you've made it this far, if you've followed every twist, every contradiction, every piece of evidence, then you're part of this investigation now. You're not just a viewer, you're a witness. And witnesses have power. The power to amplify, the power to demand accountability, the power to make sure Summer's story doesn't get buried. So here's what I need you to do. Subscribe to Criminal Instinct right now, not later, right now. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single update. Because this case isn't over, not by a long shot. We're going to keep digging, we're going to keep asking questions, and we're going to keep holding people accountable until we get answers. But I also need you to do something else. I need you to engage. Drop a comment right now and tell me what you think happened. Do you believe the official story? Or do you think there's a third explanation that law enforcement won't talk about? What's your theory? What questions do you still have? And what do you think should happen next? Share this video. Send it to someone who cares about justice. Post it on your social media. Tag people who need to see this. Because the algorithm doesn't care about truth. It cares about engagement. And the more people who watch, comment, and share, the harder it becomes for this case to be ignored. Summer Wells was 5 years old. She loved playing outside. She loved her family. She deserved to grow up. She deserved to be safe. And she deserves answers. Not the answers law enforcement wants to give, but the answers the evidence demands. The Convergence Corridor is real. The pathway is visible. And the truth is out there. We just have to be willing to follow it. No matter where it leads, no matter who it implicates, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people. So stay with me. Keep watching, keep questioning, keep demanding more, because this is how cases get solved, not in silence, but in the light. And together, we're going to make sure Summer's story stays in the light until justice is served. Subscribe, comment, share, and let's finish what we started. Summer is waiting.